Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining me. This is Alonso Trejo Mora, a part of the VMware Solutions Engineering team, and the focus of this discussion today is going to be vRealize operations installation as part of the broader area of VMware that is VMware Cloud Management. Now, in order to perform this installation, specifically an on-premise installation of vRealize operations, there are really four key areas that we're going to be focusing on. And the first is interoperability, doing our homework ahead of time into the fact that vRealize operations needs to be compatible with certain versions of our VMware portfolio, and we want to make sure that we check that at first. The next part is VMware documentation. What documentation is out there, not just for our initial installation, but for ongoing use and management of the tool. And thirdly, the installation of the software itself. And finally, the configuration of that deployed software for the usage for our purposes, a small scale single site environment, ballparked at about 300 virtual machines or less. Now, some notes about our sample environment today. What we have in front of us are Firefox and Chrome as a potential option. And I wanted to point this out specifically because I've come into issues when using Chrome for this installation. And this is specifically in two key areas. The installation of the OVF file first, OVA being the object file, if you will, for vRealize operations that gets imported into the vCenter environment. And the second is the vRealize operations interface after it has been configured and deployed. And specifically, it is the fact that in a Chrome browser, or at least my version of Chrome in this environment, I've been experiencing issues where elements do not show up or render properly. The same URL copied into Firefox will render it properly. I'm not sure if it's related just to the version in this environment, but I want to make you aware of why Firefox is my browser of choice today, and also why, if you encounter issues with maybe the OVF file not installing correctly, or the OVF file not deploying correctly, or even the UI not rendering, it could be a browser issue. So our first step, as mentioned before, we'll take a quick peek at our environment. We see that we have an environment here, vCenter, with a couple hosts associated with it, a single site. But our focus is first going to be on interoperability. And we see that the URL first is interopmatrix.vmware.com. And with this, you're able to check vRealize operations for the version that you like. In this case, we're using the latest version, 8.6, and compare that to the other platforms in our VMware environment. For instance, the ESXi hypervisor, vSAN, NSXT data center, Horizon, among others. And so for this sample run of my matrix, we already see that 8.6 is not necessarily compatible with all versions of all VMware products, right? There are legacy versions that are not on this list as supported or compatible. And so it's important, before we even consider deploying vRealize operations, that our environment is compatible by version. After we've verified compatibility, and actually, right before I get ahead of myself, if we were to then upgrade our vRealize operations instance to a new version, a later version, say that we were sitting on 8.4 and we wanted to upgrade up to 8.6, we do have an upgrade path option to tell us, can you do it in one hop or not? And sometimes we do need to hop from version to version in order to do an upgrade if we have let things stay on the same version for too long. Once we've verified, though, for our main focus, that we are interoperable, the next step is to go into our actual documentation. Now, docs.vmware.com vRealize operations has a ton of resources when it comes to not just installation and configuration, but ongoing management. And we see that they organize it by version as well. vRealize operations 8.6, 8.5, 8.4, and this is vRealize operations on premise. We do actually have a repository for a cloud option, our SaaS option of vRealize operations, that is managed, hosted by VMware. You would not have to do the deployment. There is documentation for that as well. However, this is for our on-premise installation, which is the focus of today. And we see there's a dropdown for product documentation. A lot of helpful information already here. Reference architecture, secure configuration, even an API programming guide, definitions for elements, terminology used in the console like metrics, properties, and alerts. What we'll be focusing on specifically, though, is this vApp deployment guide. This is how we will be deploying our vRealize operations instance. So if we were to go ahead and click on this and hit try again, there we go. We see some options about the installation, preparing for installation, installing, resizing, and so on. When it comes to actually sizing our environment or even identifying prereqs, this is a great place to look at what is expected in an environment where you're going to deploy vRealize operations. And one of the options here is sizing and scaling requirements. I'm going to put a focus on this, as well as general cluster node requirements and best practices that can be looked at. For sizing and scaling, we'll get more into this when we actually deploy, but it is going to ask us how big we want our appliance to be, as well as if we want to configure availability for our appliance. And making that selection can be better informed through this resource right here, this knowledge base article. I actually have it opened up right here. And so this is for 8.6. We have it for other versions too through that same link. And when you see this, no need to panic, right? So we have extra small, medium, large, and there are a lot of parameters that we can look at. For the most part, the sizing recommendations that are given are fine, but in the case that there's a particular environment with a lot more metrics than a given size is recommended to have, you can upsize to the next option. And as well, when it comes to if we want to add something like a remote collector, and now we're calling it a cloud proxy, but basically this way of adding data centers that have a high latency relative to your appliance, or expanding vROPS' reach in that way. This is also one way to identify what should the size of those be. What kinds of latencies do we have to work for or work through? And this sizing guide can be a great thing to have open if we have those questions. Now that we've looked at the sizing guidelines, let's look at the environment we'd actually be deploying our vRealize operations instance to. So I actually already went ahead and did a trial run, but we will delete this from disk because we are going to deploy a fresh new version. Now we have a blank environment here, 5 hosts, vCenter managed, as mentioned before, single site. And where we will do our download is actually in the Customer Connect portal, customerconnect.vmware.com. Now, as a VMware customer, customers have access to this page. And specifically, we see Home, My Products, and then All Products for downloads. If a customer has purchased licensing or the access as an admin to download the binaries for vRealize operations, here is where it will appear. Specifically, we go to the Infrastructure and Operations Management section and view our download options for vRealize operations. Now, something to note here, to my understanding, Standard, Advanced, and Enterprise at the binaries level, software level, should be the same. It really, the Enterprise, Advanced, and Standard features that you unlock depending on the license you purchase, really the license gets inserted into the vRealize operations or typed into vRealize operations during deployment, and we will see that happen. I don't think this file is independent or different depending on which version you pick here. And we even notice as we select one of the options that there is no real mention of addition anywhere here. Now there are 2 sections, vRealize Operations Manager, binary files, and vRealize Operations Cloud Appliance. Again, cloud is our SaaS offering. That is not going to be our focus of today. So our focus will be Operations Manager, specifically the appliance installation. So we'll go ahead and download that now. We see that Firefox doesn't allow nested viewing. That's okay. If we wanted to see the EULA, we could open it up on a separate page or a separate tab. Once we have reviewed the licenses conditions, we can agree to those terms and begin our download for our file. Right off the bat, one of the things to notice, 2.6 gigabytes in size, and it is a .ova extension file, or OVF. So we'll give that a couple seconds to download. And meanwhile, we see here our environment. If we right-click on region A01, we have the ability to deploy an OVF template. So once our file is done installing, that is what we're going to do to get vRealize operations, its associated operating system, installation scripts and packages, those all encompassed within this OVA file, deploy those onto vCenter and begin our installation. First, however, we will want to make sure that DNS is properly configured for our vRealize operations appliance. So we've allocated we've allocated a given IP address for vRealize operations, which a static IP address is heavily recommended, then we can associate that with a user-friendly FQDN like vROPS-01A. In my particular scenario, I am in a Windows environment. I can check through DNS Manager that I have forward lookup zones established specifically for vROPS. So here we see that I've actually already gone ahead and created this record with specifically the allocation vROPS-01A 192.168.110.130 as my IP address of choice. If we wanted to create a new A record specifically for this DNS configuration, we could go ahead and do so with a new host or A record. For my given IP address. And creating that associated pointer record is going to help us with the reverse lookup, because we want to make sure reverse lookup works as well. So not just how do I map the host to the IP address or the IP address to the, but also the IP address to the host. I've already gone ahead and done that, but if we wanted to verify reverse lookup, we could do that here. So 110, so 192.168.110, read backwards. And here is our reverse pointer, 192.168.110.130 to vROPS-01A. So that has been configured and established. Excellent. With that verified, looks like our download is completed. So what we can do now is deploy our actual OVF template into our environment. We'll make sure it's a local file, that we see that we could have a remote URL to a remote server housing our OVA as well. I'll scroll out a little bit. Perfect. We'll give this virtual machine the name vROPS-01A in accordance with our DNS records, and this is specifically for inventory as well, where it would be located. Now, as far as selecting a compute resource, I could allow DRS to pick a host for me. In this particular case, I have enlarged ESX-04A for the specific purpose of landing vRealize operations as an appliance on that host. But as mentioned, if you did have your vSphere environment with DRS as a capability, you could pick the compute cluster and it would pick for you. We can review the details, and one immediate thing to point out is the big difference between picking thick provision versus thin provisioning on our disk. We do have the ability to thin provision. Otherwise, if you would want to do thick provisioning, you will require 274 gigs. Thin provisioning upfront, 1 gig. So depending on your storage needs, that could be a very different answer for you. Check our licensing agreements again for our deployment. And here is where we select our size. Now, there is a lot of helpful information here on the right in terms of what a size corresponds to ballpark in terms of virtual machines and how much that given deployment appliance is going to need for that size in CPU and memory. This is where, for instance, if we wanted to check our sizing and scaling knowledge base article, which we brought up before, that is one thing that we could do to better inform us of what decision to make. In our particular case, we're dealing with a small environment, proof of concept in this particular instance as well. So we will use the extra small size. Next, storage. And here's an important point. If we were to select the storage, select our option, and then click out of the storage and reselect it, it resets back. So just an important note here, select your storage first and then select the virtual disk format. For our network, we will pick the management network, which for us is ESXi region A01, specifically a virtual distributed switch. And here is where we customize our settings, including supply the IP address for the gateway, our default gateway, our DNS, the IP address of the virtual machine itself. As I mentioned, .130 will be my particular selection. And in this case, we could also do, we could also add, if we wanted to, a different time zone. An important thing is I would recommend leaving it ETC or UTC. The reason for this is it makes it easier for logging. Typically, it's just a more universally accepted time zone. So in this case, I'm going to leave it as ETC. Default gateway. Domain name, in our case, corp.local. Domain name servers. Excellent. So we review our information and click finish. Now, as part of our recent tasks, we'll see the importing of the OVF package, deploying of the Ovf template. Some ask, well, at what point do you experience these issues with your OVF being corrupted during downloading Chrome? Why is this, where does it come up as an issue? These tasks would fail as a result, and have failed for me as a result if the OVF download is corrupted. So this would be the step in which I would see issues. This takes a little bit of time, and so I'm going to go ahead and pause the recording, and I'll see you in a quick second. Okay, it looks like we're just about done. Excellent. So our virtual machine has been deployed, and we see it now in our vCenter inventory here visible. And since we've configured DNS, let's go ahead and turn it on. I'll open it up in a separate web console so we see what goes on in the appliance. A quick note for these installation scripts. There is a point within the tasks where you may see, it might or might not show, that one of the tasks in LSB initialization script may show up with a failed error. Now, this does not necessarily mean that your appliance will not work or that there's anything wrong with the script. Sometimes some tasks just try to run before others during this process. So in case you do see that failure issue on one of the tasks near the end, just know that that might not necessarily mean there's anything wrong with your actual appliance. I'll try to call it out if I do receive it in this installation. However, these scripts we see will take a little bit of time, so I'll go ahead and pause the recording again. Okay, we are just about finishing with our initialization script. Everything has been green, and we see that one error, in fact, a couple for the same error. And that is the one that I wanted everyone to see is an error, but once we actually go ahead and configure the vRealize operations appliance, we'll see that that actually does not play in our remaining usage of the platform. So now that we have finished with the installation, we are greeted with this pane. To manage your appliance, please browse to https:192.168.110.130. We'll go ahead and do that now and actually close out of some of these tabs here. So let's double check that. And we see that it immediately begins to redirect us to the vRealize operations UI. And on initial installation, what we'll see in a moment is that it actually redirects us to the admin section of vRealize operations, not 192.168.110.130/UI, but actually /admin. And that's because we haven't actually configured our vRealize operations cluster. In this environment that we're about to see, it's also where you would select additional hosts and add additional hosts to your environment in order to, for instance, establish availability, high availability, continuous availability, different design choices for vRealize operations. And those might include additional nodes, as well as just the overall starting of your quote unquote control node or master node for your vRealize operations environment. And it has, in fact, sent us to admin new cluster action. So before that, we see that we're greeted with three choices: express installation, new installation, and expand an existing. I almost always select new installation. It is not much more information than express installation and allows us to do additional things such as define our NTP server IP address as well as our certificate if we have one. So I'll go ahead and choose this for this session. A helpful initial visual of what we're going to be doing. Click next. And set our account credentials for our vRealize operations when we decide to log in. Then if we wanted to, we could install a certificate. In this case, we'll just use the self-signed or default, as well as our deployment settings. So here we can establish our NTP server address. Clicking add here, and our master node name. So for instance, we could give this the name vROPS control 01A. If we were to configure availability, this is where we would do so. And just for a quick second so we can look at the descriptions, high availability would be effectively an allocation of resources such that if vRealize operations were to go down, we could automatically create a new instance of vRealize operations to pick up with as little downtime as possible given a failure. Continuous availability, on the other hand, is more resource intensive, we'll put it that way, on the network, on your resources. However, it synchronizes the data across two fault zones, fault domains, where you have nodes on one domain and nodes in the other domain. And so it will effectively be replicating the information across, such that if a catastrophic event were to happen and one fault domain were completely down, you have a copy at your other domain to continue working. For this purpose, we will not be configuring availability. We are just going to deploy one node. Here's where you may add additional nodes if they were existing. And once we finalize our configuration, we're greeted with this still admin section, preparing the node for first use. Once it's available, I can then click it and start vRealize operations now that our cluster has been configured, whether it be for availability or not. This will take a little bit of time, so I'll go ahead and pause the recording until the node is up and running. Okay, so we see that the node is identified and created in our admin console, vROPS control 01A for vROPS-01a.corp.local, cluster role is master, state not running, status offline. Now we could configure, for instance, SSH status here, as well as add additional nodes and configure availability options. In our case, we'll go ahead and click start. However, here we could also select an NTP setting or adjust it, as well as add a certificate. And if we wanted to do a standalone software update, here is where we could do that for vROPS as well. So we'll go ahead and start. And this will take some additional time, so I'll pause the recording again. First, a warning, or more so a reminder, before starting vRealize operations for the first time, ensure you have the adequate number of nodes to manage your environment effectively. To add another node to the cluster, use a web browser to navigate to the node you want to add and choose expand existing installation during the installation process of that node. Now I'll pause the recording now while it's initializing. Quick update on our installation and initialization of our cluster. We see that now there are objects in process and metrics in process. And so once we're able to actually configure our vCenter connection in vROPS, which we'll get to in a second, we'll be able to actually start processing these metrics, collecting these metrics and authenticating to vCenter and getting a lot of visualization in our vROPS environment. Okay, our initialization has just finished and we were immediately redirected into now 192.168.110.130/UI/login. So a different section of vRealize operations where we can finally log into our appliance and start configuring the environment itself. Before we go ahead and do this though, let's also verify that DNS is operational. So vROPS-01a.corp.local, let's add HTTPS there first. And we do in fact redirect to the UI as well. So that is a good sign. DNS is working properly. And so we can go ahead and use this for the rest of the configuration. Here are the credentials that I specified on the initial setup of our appliance. And so we're greeted with an initial setup here for accepting our EULA, and if we have a product key, inserting our product key for a particular edition, number of CPUs or OSIs that we've purchased for our environment. So we will accept the end user license agreement. In this case, use our evaluation key. If we had a product key, we could go ahead and put that there, as well as validate. And join the customer experience program, sending telemetry back to VMware on what does and does not work. And now we are greeted with our 8.6 interface. Now functionality compared to previous versions has been improved in certain areas, but in terms of overall usage, and it is pretty much the same. We do see a different user interface though. A lot of the categorizations are now on the left side, and there is a series of, quite frankly, streamlined workflows already in terms of, for instance, adding new data sources or looking at our inventory. But on first installation, on first opening, we even see that it asks, well, begin monitoring your environment by adding your first cloud account. Would you like to add a cloud account? I say yes. And we also have some tutorials at the bottom, as we saw, for using vROPS. Now, when mentioning cloud account does not necessarily, in VMware terms, in VMware world, does not necessarily mean AWS or Azure or GCP. We think of it more like a cloud operating model, right? So your vCenter environment operating like a cloud account. VMware Cloud on AWS or Azure VMware Solutions, partnerships with our major hyperscalers, as well as some additional components like our NSXT Manager, Log Insight, Automation, Network Insight, just to name a few out of the box integrations that we already have. In addition to that, we have the ability to add other kinds of extensions, and we will get to those in a second. But first, let's configure our vCenter deployment. I'll give it the same name that we have for its FQDN, vCSA-01A. We'll provide here the credentials for that vCenter. Let's clean that up. If we were to use a separate account here that didn't have full admin access, yet we wanted to add an additional account for performing actions such as resizing or deleting of infrastructure virtual machines. One way to do that would be to add this additional account of credentials with those kinds of more destructive, so to speak, capabilities, or another way to say it is more elevated permissions on our vCenter environment. And a not optional step for our connection to our vCenter is to validate the connection. This is actually what is going to allow us to accept the certificate with our connection to vCenter. Now, taking a quick second to look at some of our other advanced settings here at the bottom. We see that there is, for instance, auto discovery. So the auto discovery of new objects in our vCenter environment, we typically would want to leave that as true, as well as a few other options with information regarding each one. One that is left default, and it is up to the user whether they would like to activate it or not, is predictive DRS. This actually allows vROPS to send its information as well as its trend analysis to vCenter for its DRS activities. For those who don't know, DRS is a vSphere capability for Enterprise Plus currently licensing. And effectively what it does is it allows vCenter to automatically move virtual machines to the hosts it deems best for virtual machine resource requirements. Or if you have a new virtual machine and you were to place it in vCenter, as you saw when I was selecting a compute resource for deploying vROPS, I could let DRS decide for me which host is the best for placing that virtual machine. This would add additional information based on, for instance, behavior, cyclical or trending usage, resource usage, or load on a virtual machine if it thinks that it foresees the need for a migration, and in order to do proactively start moving virtual machines that way. We will leave it false for now. Okay, and this is simply because I've deployed vRealize operations, a separate instance of vRealize operations previously and registered. We'll override that. We see our vCenter adapter is operational with a status of OK. Sometimes it takes a couple seconds or a couple minutes in order to go from a yellow status to a green, though this was fairly quick. One other thing that I did want to make sure to point out is we noticed that our blue appliance here, our actual vROPS virtual machine, has a login option here. If we go ahead and do that and type root, here is where we'd actually set up a password for our appliance. I have run into cases when being requested this where it will just ask for a password with no indication of there being an old one or anything like that. Sometimes you might just need to go further into the process of cluster initialization, exit out of the web console that you currently have open and open up a new one. And typically that should open up to the prompt for a new password. Here on this pane, we could do things that are much deeper in terms of administration for vROPS. Maybe, for instance, create a log bundle or access log bundles for our vROPS appliance, as well as look into the specific files that run our vRealize operations data node. However, most users will not have to interact with that, right? Looking at our UI console, one of the ways that we can start seeing if we're collecting data is simply typing or searching for our different objects. And here we see we've pulled the version of our vCenter, and we are starting to get a hierarchical view of our objects. Now it's going to take a little bit of time for these objects to properly send metrics over to vRealize operations and to be captured from vCenter to vROPS. And so I'll give, actually, and rather than pausing, we can talk about something else in the meantime while we wait. So I did mention that in addition to the vCenter, AWS account, Azure accounts, there are other ways to extend our capabilities for vRealize operations to collect on other infrastructure, other metrics, say a pure array or a Cisco switch, and maybe even going deeper into our application level, right? And looking at specific applications. So there are integrations with vRealize operations that can be done in addition to those that we've seen, and that is through our management pack ecosystem. So management packs are essentially a collection of metrics, alerts, dashboards, reports, even the method through which we authenticate into different platforms like OpenManage or Pure, and effectively connect our vRealize operations to other parts of our ecosystem for collection. Management packs also include dashboards, and so different ways that we tell vRealize operations how to understand and consume data. In addition to endpoints, we can also add compliance packs for a few different compliance options. And so that gives us the ability to benchmark our current infrastructure configurations towards these different rule sets that might be needed for your environment. Where are these management packs located? Well, I'm glad you asked. So they are actually in the VMware marketplace, marketplace.cloud.vmware.com. And so in order to search or filter for management packs, I'll zoom out for a second. What we can do is actually go ahead and search in our solutions area for management pack, click show all, and this will give us a lot of different options. We did see that there were about 800 possible options when you type the word management pack. Now, specifically for what is compatible with vRealize operations, what's the management pack for vRealize operations? We can go here to the left side, product compatibility, and select vRealize operations to get the 166 management packs relevant to us today. It's important to note that if you do change the search criteria to something else, it's possible that this filter gets removed. So just a double check and a sanity check is to see vRealize operations here as part of the filtering. Now, as an example, we see a couple different management packs options, including one for instance, MongoDB, SNMP. As I mentioned, there's Apache Tomcat, Cisco, so a few different options, in addition to some of the ones that are out of the box with vRealize operations. And we did recently acquire, relatively, Blue Medora as a partner who were extremely strong with the creation of management packs. And so we do offer that in our True Visibility suite for additional extension with a wide range of third-party infrastructure and application solutions or options. Now, looking at one option in particular, here is where we could sign into our marketplace and download this particular .pak or pack file to then upload it to our vRealize operations environment. Now, if we were to check as well compatibility of management packs, perhaps some have been deprecated, some have been absorbed into the out-of-the-box vRealize operations solution. This actually typically isn't the most up-to-date. I will actually recommend that we use our interoperability matrix, trusty interoperability matrix, to double check that. So as an example, vRealize operations. And note there is also vRealize Operations Cloud. Our focus is vRealize Operations, not vRealize Operations Cloud, which again is our SaaS option. vRealize Operations version 8.6, and we could check that or benchmark that against, say, vRealize Operations management pack, and there are several options here that we can select. One, for instance, being, we can pick here for SNMP as an example. To check the interoperability and see 8.6 is compatible with 3.2. And this could be true for other management packs as well. Checking the versions. Okay, so going back to our object hierarchy. Okay, we see that from the scope of virtual machine vROPS-01A, we get the hierarchy of all of our different objects here available. We start seeing green check marks as well as a ton of configuration information collected. Some not available, right, because we've only been running this for a couple minutes, but the recommendation would be, depending on your use case and what specific trend recommendations you might need, about 2 weeks or so, right? A month. It really depends on the cyclicity, the behavior of your environment and how it lives and breathes. But as far as recommendations go, maybe for right sizing purposes or capacity purposes, the more information we have, the better the recommendations are. See the green here for the fact that we are in fact collecting via our vCenter adapter and the data is receiving. Now, if we were to go to our vCenter and its perspective, which we can refresh here, we get a different view. So from the vCenter's perspective for assets under management, we see our 5 hosts, 2 virtual machines, effectively our vCenter, vSphere inventory. And as we add more integrations and management packs, we could get those as well. In addition, if we wanted to see where those raw metrics actually are and what those values are, we can check here for instance, demand percentage. So we get some initial values here for CPU, as well as additional options in our metrics section, and relationship mapping from vCenter to the rest of the environment to get a nice holistic view of our infrastructure. Right, and then depending on your screen size, right, mileage may vary on the best way you want to fit this or consume this information. But effectively, this is how you can start getting a very detailed view on your environment to implement root cause analysis. And as mentioned, this would be for our vSphere objects specifically out of the box. We can add additional public cloud, for instance, services in application level monitoring and processes, as well as even go granular with the databases and switches. There's a lot of extensibility options. As mentioned, one great way to get a lot of those off the bat is the True Visibility Suite. And in terms of added enablement and engagement, right, there is a vRealize Operations Sample Exchange, a ton of information on YouTube, a lot of information via VMware docs. And so with that, there is a very mature ecosystem when it comes to vRealize Operations added learnings. In addition, if you did want more formalized training, VMware does offer education for vRealize operations certification or just overall install, configure, manage knowledge. And through that, if there were any needs to integrate with additional products, implement a very complex use case, we typically have good resources, very good resources in order to do that. So that has been a review of vRealize operations in installation. I hope that this has been informative. I hope it's been helpful. And most importantly, I hope that it has been reproducible if you are considering this as part of your environment. My name is Alonso Trejo Mora, part of the VMware Solution Engineering team, and I always welcome any and all feedback, whether it be on this channel or at my email, atm8119@gmail.com. Feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, Alonso Trejo Mora. And without anything else, thank you for tuning in with me and hope you have a good rest of the day, as always.